Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of 10 of this series of how the narrative is changing for the arts, for classical music, all the different disciplines. I'm Aubrey Bergauer, if I haven't met you yet. And all of these different weeks have been on my feed. They're back cataloged if you want to go look. But today's topic is one that so many people have asked me about over, I would say, really the last year and a half or so. So many of you watching right now have reached out to me as well. And that topic is company culture. So on this series, the whole idea about how the narrative is changing is that anybody who's followed me for a while knows that normally I'm talking about how the narrative needs to change, the things that we can be doing differently at our organizations and institutions to really deliver the results we need. And yet the pandemic has accelerated so much change for all of us, both good and bad. And part of the good is this idea of really starting to make incremental movement on these different topics we're covering over these 10 weeks. And like I said, this week, company culture. So what's interesting to me on this idea of company culture is that it used to not be at the forefront of the discussion for arts organizations pretty much at all, in my experience, and really has shifted, like I said, over the last year, maybe the last 2 years. So if you've been following me for a while, back in 2017, one of my blog posts that I wrote got quite a bit of traction, but one of the headlines of that post was a quote from Capacity Interactive. If you're in the arts, especially if you're a marketer, you know Capacity Interactive, digital arts marketing firm. And at the time, senior consultant and then VP there, Ashley Dunn-Gatterdam, had said on their podcast that she had never heard an arts organization talk about company culture or defining what that meant. And I remember listening to her say that and thinking, oh my gosh, I think she's right. So that was back in 2017. That's the old narrative, the old way of doing things. Fast forward to today, and now it's 2022, and company culture is part of the day-to-day conversation. We don't always get it right. I know that that's true, but there is talk now of our values. We're going to get into that later today. There is talk about who do we want to be? How do we want to operate and navigate in this world as institutions? This is a big shift. Like I said, not part of the narrative in 2017, is part of the day-to-day conversation now. We're working our way through it as organizations. We're moving it forward. This is a good way the narrative has changed. So to be part of this conversation today, oh gosh, you guys, I am so excited for this one. I have Kevin Oakes joining us, and he is going to talk about this topic of company culture and a lot of different facets of what that looks like. And just to share how I first came across his work, the first is I read a lot. Many of you know that if you follow me, you read my book reviews every year. And I read his book, Culture Renovation, came out a year ago. We were just talking about this offline. It's in its 5th printing. So it's just, I'm not the only one who's fangirling over this book. People everywhere are just really eating it up because it's good. I heard him on a couple different podcasts. For the Brene Brown fans out there, he was on Dare to Lead. And so I'm just really happy that when I reached out, he said yes, and he's here with us today. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking with Kevin, hearing about company culture from him firsthand, from the research he's done, from the companies and leaders he interviewed for his book. And just to start getting things going, I'll put this out there for it to be percolating in your brain. And that is, many of you hopefully saw, I put a poll out on LinkedIn over the weekend. It's had hundreds of votes, I think thousands of impressions at this point. And the poll was, what do you think is the most important part of company culture? The number one answer from all of you for that was feeling like your work has purpose. So put a pin in that. We'll come back to that later. And the number 2 response from all of you was feeling like your workplace has psychological safety. And that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, we'll get Kevin to weigh in on that when he comes on in a bit here, but just thought I would share with you, that's what you all said was the most important part of company culture for you. So as we're getting going here, please share this live stream in your feeds, whether you're watching it online live now or online after the fact later. please, if you think this topic has benefit to other people in our field and in our industry, share it. That'll be really helpful to get this word out there and get this expertise to as many people as possible. And please also weigh in on the comments. Kevin was saying to me earlier, he was like, he loves the interaction, wants your questions, wants your comments. You guys know I all love that, or I also love that too. So please, I'll try to keep an eye on that chat. Would love to hear from you. All right. Let's talk about Kevin Oakes. I'm going to bring him on here in just a second. Kevin is the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP. He's really the leading authority on next practices in human capital, human resources, the people that we work with. He's the author of Culture Renovation, as I mentioned, and this has been, I told you, it's very popular. It's been a #1 release in like a dozen different Amazon categories. So again, totally encourage you to pick up the book if you haven't yet. And what's great about the book, everybody knows I'm super data driven if you followed me for basically any amount of time. And I like that he's not just pontificating on company culture. He brought in data from one of the largest studies ever conducted on corporate culture. So this research, these findings really get into the details of how high performance organizations that we've all heard of, companies such as Microsoft, T-Mobile, 3M, MasterCard, and several others, really gets into how they have successfully changed their own organizational culture. And if massive institutions and corporations like those can create a shift for the better, then absolutely arts organizations can do the same and apply some of these findings that Kevin is going to share with us to our work. So before I bring him on here, what I like about this is just a few more things. Like I said, these big companies, they can make the changes, so can we. And two, I'll say the way Kevin writes about each of these principles does feel very applicable. I could see myself applying this work, both in the consulting clients I work with, and then someday when I'm back leading another orchestra, it just feels like, yes, I get it. I see how this can play out. And then lastly, I'll say, this is totally on brand. The entire point of culture renovation is that change is possible, right? So it definitely matches my brand, as I said, definitely matches this whole series, and that the change is happening in our industry before our eyes. And this is a good thing. So one more time, use the chat, ask your questions, cheer Kevin on. Let me bring him on here for us. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Aubrey. That's a very nice intro. I appreciate that.
No problem. So let's get into it. I've got a bunch of questions. You and I were saying offline, we will cram in as much as we can. We'll hit as much as we can. And then, like I said, I'm going to keep an eye on this chat and then bring in anything else that comes up from anybody watching live. Sure. So first question, can you share an example of an organization or industry that is very slow to change? And then if you do have the end of that story, that's good. That's even better.
Yeah. Well, as you correctly pointed out in the book, it's not only database, but there are a lot of stories in there about real life situations and companies that have undergone culture change, both on the good side and the bad side. And in fact, I write a monthly newsletter where each month I have a culture fail of the month. So I talk about some companies that probably could change. One company that I did profile in the book that I think has been slow to change, it probably won't come as a big shock, is Boeing. Boeing, anytime you have a large organization, it's going to be hard to change culture. But Boeing in particular has had some issues, around their overall culture that has manifested itself into some real tragedies. And we all know the 737 MAX tragedies, and the U.S. House Representatives blame that on a culture of concealment in their investigation of those tragedies. And what they meant by that was there wasn't psychological safety, as you mentioned earlier, in the company at the time, where engineers and others felt comfortable sharing some of their concerns. And, that was, one of the factors that led to those tragedies, unfortunately. Now, obviously, they're doing a lot to try to change that, and I think they're making some good progress. But they're one that I profiled in the book around, the slowness to change the culture and some of the ramifications of it. Despite that, I think when you look at some of the big companies that you mentioned that have been very successful in changing their culture, Microsoft was one that I featured early in the book. I think there's lessons there for any size company in any industry to take away and use within their own organization. I talk to a lot of smaller startups or nonprofits, and the lessons that I highlight from some of those larger companies are completely applicable to those smaller organizations.
I want to hit on that a little bit more, if you would. I think what is so interesting, I love the Microsoft case study. As you know, many of you watching also know I lived in Seattle for almost a decade before moving to San Francisco. So that company was just so prevalent in my life. My ex worked there. I mean, so I feel like I saw this culture almost firsthand. And then reading about the change and now seeing everything Satya has done has just been really amazing. But my question out of this is to pick up on what you just said, that there are so many things that you don't have to be a massive institution like Microsoft. There are things that smaller organizations can do to bring about this change. So how to start is really the question. Where to start? Does this answer vary by organization size, or is it really sort of the same process no matter who you are or where you're at?
Well, that was kind of why we wrote the book. I didn't set out to write a book. We set out to do a research study on culture change because we recognize that most companies who set out to change their culture, they fail, and many fail miserably at trying to do so. And only about 15% actually succeed in changing their culture. And I've seen other research studies that have similar success metrics. What we were very curious about was that 15%, was there some kind of blueprint that other organizations could follow if they want to change culture? There are a lot of books on culture out there, but they tend to stay very ethereal and high level.
Yes.
And what I was trying to create was a manual that CEOs and organizations could use to enact that change. And so it's organized into 3 phases: plan, build, and maintain. And the reason we chose those phases is because as we got into doing this research, we were using the term culture transformation, which most people use when they talk about culture change. But we recognized that none of those successful companies really transformed their cultures. What they did was renovate, and that became a better term to use and almost a safer term to use, because those successful companies kept what made them great to begin with, kept what was unique and hard to replace. But like an old house, they renovated to improve the future value of that house going forward. Now, like in an old house, you wouldn't just go in if you're going to renovate that and start knocking down walls without having a plan, because you're going to knock down a load-bearing wall and bring the whole thing down. And the same metaphor holds true for companies. And so I think those successful companies did a very good job at first listening to the workforce, really gauging employee sentiment, really understanding what some of the underlying issues are. By the time things get up to the senior team, it gets filtered. And this happens, I see it happen all the time. And I tell executives, the worst thing you can do is lock yourselves in a conference room and decide what the culture is today, because you'll get it wrong, right? You've got to really understand what the employee sentiment is. And Microsoft did this well. They understood the employee sentiment, and Satya did a fantastic job at embracing the HR team and the head of HR in this effort to plan how they wanted to change the culture, because he knew it had to change going forward. And he set out some basic tenets. I think creating a very simple rallying cry inside the organization is an important one. At Microsoft, it was all around growth mindset and the ability to constantly be learning. One of Microsoft's problems that you probably recognize very well, Aubrey, from the past, was that people used knowledge as power, and they were very reticent to share their knowledge. And they used knowledge to protect themselves, protect their fiefdoms. And what Satya said right out of the gate is, I want a culture of learn-it-alls, not a culture of know-it-alls. And I want knowledge sharing to be power, not knowledge to be power. And that's the mantra that they've really incorporated throughout the organization. It's very much a learning culture, and growth mindset is something that everybody in the organization understands and knows and can recite. And so that's all part of this planning process. How are we going to roll out a very consistent message to the organization and set our cultural path. And, how are we going to define behaviors that we want to see from our leaders, et cetera, before we really enact the culture change we want to see.
Yeah, I love that. So, okay, gosh, you touched on a couple other things that now I have these follow-up questions for that are so, I just see the parallels to arts organizations. So first follow-up is, you say in the book to put a number to this idea of balancing the past. It's not just a transformation, but we got to have a plan and all of that. You say that 57% of successful culture change organizations, so 57% of the success stories, focused on what to keep of the past culture and not ignore the parts of who they were that they want to carry forward. I think for arts organizations, this is potentially our biggest fear. We're an art form and industry based on tradition. How do we keep what we do want to keep and maintain, and yet do renovate and do things differently going forward? So can you speak more to this? How do we grapple with finding that balance?
Well, I think that's where you've got to listen to the workforce to make sure they are bringing up things that they think are unique and powerful about the organization, but also what does need to change going forward. As a leadership team, it's important to all be on the same page too on what that culture change effort needs to look like going forward. From there, you've got, there's a lot of focus on trying to make sure that you've got the right sentiment and the right people inside the organization to help with that change. While this needs to be leader-led, it can't be 100% done by leaders. You've got to get the cooperation of the workforce, and there's got to be a mentality around co-creation of the culture change. And so early on, we talk about this concept of organizational network analysis, which is really understanding who are the influencers and who are the energizers inside the organization. In any organization, any department, division, there are these go-to people that everybody seems to turn to for information, for expertise, but a lot of times just for energy, right? And there are people in your life, Audrey, that you talk to and they fire you up after you talk to them. And then there are others who, after you talk to them, they just kind of suck the life out of you. They're like Darth Vader. You want to really understand who those influences are, because ultimately they'll become your culture champions. People call them different things, ambassadors. Microsoft called it a culture cabinet. But those people are the ones that are going to make it happen at the ground level. And so I think identifying those people is the hardest part. Many times they're introverts, they're not extroverts, and most of the time they're buried in the hierarchy. So leadership doesn't really understand who they are. And that's why doing a thorough analysis can help illuminate who those energizers are.
I love this. This part of the book was so illuminating for me, I have to say personally. So we have a bunch of different roles watching this. So for anybody who's in a CEO role, I think the lens I had defaulted to was I have to model change from the top. Which is not wrong, but it's not complete. And so this section of the ONA, organizational network analysis, identifying these cultural influencers within, I was like, right. And I've been on this personal quest over the last few years, I would say, of just really trying to learn how to better empower others so that everybody feels powerful no matter their level of seniority. Okay, so this all started coming together for me in this light bulb moment as I was reading. And I guess my question is, can you talk more about how to identify these cultural influencers? And then this is also coming in from the chat from Sunshine. Hi, Sunshine. She's saying, I recall from previous feedback to Aubrey's blogs is that there's fear from middle management to push for this type of change and suggest that this type of renovation needs to come from the top. So anyways, a different way to say the same question, but how do we identify these people? And for anybody on this that's not a CEO role, like this question is for you. Like, what do we do with these important people?
Let me start by saying it's hard to have culture change really happen if you don't have support from the top. So I'll just say that as a blanket statement. It's not that it's impossible, but it's pretty hard to make that happen. And the way you get support from the top is to lead with data and back it up with stories from organizations that that leadership either respects or maybe even fears, so that you can get some of that buy-in. But the hard work is really done in the middle. And so that organizational network analysis is typically conducted through a survey process where you're asking employees, who influences you, who do you need more time from going forward. It's kind of a triangulation exercise to see who those indispensable people are. And we use this technique for a lot of things, not just for culture change. Right now, it's being used heavily to identify people who might be on the brink of burnout, because everybody's coming to them, and they're at the center of the beehive, and it's very likely that they're just feeling overloaded. And those are the people you can least afford to lose, and you want to make sure that you are making it safe for them to speak up and say, "Hey, I'm overloaded," or try to offload some of that. But they're also the ones that are the most influential. And so that's why you want to understand who they are, so that you can address them. And so you can use different techniques to also get at the same answer. Some people are monitoring Teams or Slack or email. I find that to be a little invasive, as a normal process. So we prefer the survey method of ONA. But critically important if you're trying to change culture going forward.
And at a smaller organization, I mean, on one hand, a smaller organization, you can identify these influencers easier because you know everybody so
Correct.
well.
It's a little easier. Yep.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be so formal as a survey at that point. It's
Right.
more organic and obvious. Okay, got it. Okay, so if somebody's not the chief executive, but they do want to push for change, do you have, I know, I mean, you're right. There has to be leadership from the top. There has to be buy-in. But I do hear a lot, to be blunt, from people all over who are just frustrated with their leadership. Is there anything somebody not in a position of traditional power can do to try to help
Yeah.
push for the renovation we need?
Well, like I said, I think data goes a long way. So the more you can use data to build your case for what you're trying to accomplish, the better off you are, and back it up with real life examples.
Mhm.
But I do see there are a number of organizations where it's been a bit of a ground root effort. Where people have filtered up some things that need to be changed inside the organization and have convinced leadership of that. I would counsel anybody to just continue to push. If it's a company you care about, make sure leaders understand that and understand what could change going forward. Because typically, if you fix the culture, the performance follows. And that's really the number one thing that I think is highlighted in the book and in the original research, that every company that has had significant culture change has typically seen their performance improve over time. It's very, very rare that you have this wildly successful organization and the culture is horrible, right? It
Right.
just, usually that doesn't happen, and it's much easier to fix the culture first.
Yeah, love it, love it. I mean, you're talking about data and storytelling. I mean, Kevin, you are speaking my language. I know we just met, but I like eat this stuff for breakfast. I love it. Okay, so kind of switching gears a little bit here. Have you done any work with a company or their culture among unionized employees? And I
Mm.
say this because so many arts and culture organizations do work with, in classical music, it's the musicians union, it's our stagehands union. Um, the opera companies have AGMA, the Actors Guild, all these things. So this is a unionized culture has its own set of challenges, I would say.
Right,
And I
right.
don't mean to speak with in too many generals or too broad of a brush, but it does have its own set of challenges. So I'm
Yeah,
just
no,
curious,
and
can you talk about that?
so I've never been part of a union personally, but I understand the challenges, and we certainly work with a lot of companies that are unionized and have powerful unions, and so it adds a layer of complexity to the whole process. But not unlike where you have different offices in different parts of the world
Mhm.
or different divisions. You're always going to have micro cultures inside the
Mhm.
organization. And sometimes that happens in what you just described from a union perspective. I think from an overall organization perspective, you want to have a purpose, and I talk a lot about this in the book, the importance of an overarching purpose that those different factions can rally to. That purpose should cascade down into the behaviors within those departments, divisions, the unions, and have values that also cascade down into those groups. So that even though you do have some microculture nuances within each, everybody is very clear on what the broader culture should be and what the broader purpose is. And I think that's part of painting that vision for the future that I talk about in the book. And there's some good examples about companies that did not do a good job of painting a vision for the future. Usually it was a CEO or a new leader who came in and blamed the past, and blamed the predecessor, as opposed to, let's ignore all that. Yeah, it happened, but we're going to focus on what we want to see, for a brighter future tomorrow. So that to me is what some of the best leaders do and some of the best organizations have done in order to rally all those microcultures towards their vision.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, lots of microcultures, not that different than a global brand that has offices all
Right.
over. Yeah, I like that. I appreciate that analogy a lot. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. So if anybody else, if you have questions, please put them in the comments. Sunshine's question earlier, I really appreciated that. Comments, questions, Kevin, you're awesome. Whatever you guys want to say in the comments, please drop a line. We want to hear from you. And while I'll see if anything else comes in, another question from me is, switching gears a bit here, I want you to weigh in on the future of remote work. So this is like changing in real time before our eyes. And I know the book has been out for a year, so I don't mean to sort of put you on the spot too much, but some parts of our organizations require in-person work. We put on performances, right? But some parts of our job don't require us to be on site. So does any of your research shed light on how company culture intersects this changing nature of our workplaces?
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why the book has continued to be so popular, because I think organizations are looking at the move to remote work and how is that affecting our culture overall. But we do more HR research than just about any other organization on the planet. And so you can imagine that during the pandemic, we've just done a ton of research on hybrid work situations, flexible work situations. We have a brand new study coming out that has examined that in depth. And where we really feel like it will never go back to the way it was. We are in an era now that people have to accept that employees will work remotely. Employees are demanding that of their current companies. They're demanding that when they go look for new jobs, to have that flexibility. But there's a big difference between hybrid and flexible work, in my opinion. Meaning that a lot of companies are saying, okay, we'll allow hybrid work, but you got to be here Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and certain hours in the day. That typically is not what employees are looking for. And anytime you put a blanket policy across a whole group, you're immediately creating exceptions. You're immediately creating a situation where that doesn't work for everybody. And what several organizations are moving to is truly flexible, which means the manager and the employee work out what's going to be best for the organization and best for the individual. And truly flexible work might mean I'm working remotely all the time, or I am coming in when I need to the organization. Or the flip side is there are a number of employees who really want to get back to the office. They have better bandwidth there. It's more quiet than their home situation, what have you. So you give them that flexibility as well. True flexibility is something that we're seeing being embraced by more and more organizations versus this sort of forced hybrid that I keep seeing in some companies. And yeah, it's changing things for sure. It's also changing the way leaders lead. And I think we have to spend a lot more time training leaders. How do I manage a virtual workforce? How do I manage a hybrid workforce, in office and remote workforce? And the better managers are understanding that and grasping that.
The better managers are understanding that and grasping that. Amen. All right. I have only about 5,000 more questions I could ask you, but we have come to the end of our half hour together. I promised everybody we'd keep these to a half hour so we can continue with our day. And I just want to say, as we're wrapping up, first and foremost, thank you, Kevin. Like I said, I'm just a fan of the book. So anybody who, if you're just joining us now, or like I said, watching this online later, one more time, the book is Culture Renovation by Kevin Oakes. It's been out for a year. I just learned it's in its 5th reprint. That means it's popular. And I really enjoyed it because it does feel so applicable. And just hearing you speak here just reinforces that these really, it's not just pontification. It's really talking about how do we apply these principles and research to our own organizations. So for everybody listening and watching, if you like what you heard or you learned something, please leave a like, leave a comment, share it in your feeds with others. If you believe other people can benefit from this conversation, that would be really appreciated. Every week, you all have been such a generous audience, and I'm just so grateful for continuing to further how the narrative is changing for our arts organizations. So follow me if you're not already. We've got 6 more weeks of this series, more topics, more great guests. I'm just so excited to bring you, so grateful to bring you. So give me a follow if you're not already. And next week, just as a real quick preview, we are covering representation, which it might be true to say that this is the part of the narrative for arts and culture that is changing the most, that has changed the most. I won't get into it now. We got a lot to get into next week, but again, I got a great guest I can't wait to bring. We're going to talk specifically about representation on our staffs. We could have a whole nother week about representation on stage, so maybe we'll be able to do that. I'm already seeing in the comments, can't wait for this. Thank you for this today. Okay, you guys are great. You're a great audience. Thank you so much. So, all right, one more time, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kevin. We're going to call it for today.
Thank you, Aubrey. Appreciate it.
You are so welcome. All right, everybody, take care, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.